Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Anaheim Ducks and lost by a score of 4-3. Now, this was a bit of a tale of two games here tonight for San Jose. First period, they came out and they were dominant. They were skating circles around the Anaheim Ducks. They put up a couple of goals, and it seemed as though they were going to cruise to a very easy victory on the night, and we'd be able to enjoy what the Sharks players would actually have to offer. But that did not end up being the case. In fact, as the second and third period would roll around, the Sharks would actually fall off a cliff completely. They were not the better team and were heavily outscored over the last 40 minutes to eventually end up losing this game. Of course, win or loss doesn't actually matter, as I have mentioned multiple times, but still, definitely disappointing after the first 20 minutes that the Sharks were actually able to pull off. Now, when it comes to the Sharks roster, no surprise here that it is incredibly different from what we saw a couple of days ago for the first game. Especially early on in the preseason, you want to give an opportunity to some of these more fringe players who, before they end up heading to the Barracuda training camp in a couple of days, to get an opportunity here at an NHL preseason. So there is a ton of roster turnover, but there were a couple of players who actually stuck in the lineup, and surprisingly, the first of them was Tyler Toffoli. Now, this is very rare for a veteran player like Tyler Toffoli to actually get a second preseason game in a row. I was suspecting he would get the one a couple of days ago, and then he might not get another one until late in the preseason, maybe the second to last or even the last game, to really begin to ramp up for the actual regular season. And yet, he's in the lineup twice in a row, and Tyler Toffoli did a lot of the same things here tonight as he did the other day. He is someone who you can really tell is that type of 25 to 30 goal scorer in the NHL. He finds himself in the correct position. He keeps his stick on the ice. He's always ready for this type of pass to reach him. He's got a very good shot. And so in the first period, he was really dominant on this top line for the San Jose Sharks. As the game wore on in the second and third, he did obviously fall off, as did the rest of the team. But generally, I thought it was a pretty good game for Tyler Toffoli, especially for a veteran playing in a second straight preseason game. Then we get to Alex Wennberg making his preseason debut and his San Jose Sharks debut with the team. Wennberg, like with Toffoli, was incredibly impressive in the first period, showed off a lot of talent offensively, which was a bit of a surprise for a player who was maybe brought in more so to be like a third-line center for San Jose. But not only was he quite strong at even strength, he also had some good looks early in this game, at the very least, on the power play, managing to score that goal, which was just very, very skilled and required a lot of talent to actually be able to put it in. So it was a good game, or a good first period for Wennberg. As the second and third period rolled around, he also faded a bit more into the background, but generally I would say this first line certainly wasn't the worst of the night for San Jose. And then when it comes to Carl Grundstrom, he's kind of the odd man out on this trio. It's very similar to the other game where it was Celebrini paired with Tyler Toffoli, and then you had kind of Klim Kostin hanging out on the side. Grundstrom filling in that role as well here tonight. Even in the first period when this line was clearly rolling and the San Jose Sharks were dominant, Grundstrom was the weak link of the line. Not to say that he was bad. He still looked decent enough, but certainly wasn't hitting those high highs as a couple of the other players there. And then as this game did wear on, Grundstrom became even more invisible than a lot of the others. You really didn't notice him all that much in the second or the third periods for San Jose. And for a player whose spot in the lineup is not guaranteed, even if there's a decent chance he makes it, it was an okay first showing, but he's definitely going to need to show some improvement as we go on in the preseason. When it comes to the second line here, we of course have Will Smith. All eyes on him. A couple of days ago, it was Macklin Celebrini making his NHL preseason debut, and he blew everybody's expectations out of the water. He was the best player on the ice for the Sharks, likely the best player on the ice amongst both teams. He scored a goal, he got an assist, and was just generally creating plays on almost every single shift that he was on for. And so, with Will Smith, while the expectations are maybe slightly lower for Smith, the idea was floated around by Mike Greer that maybe he'd get some time with the Barracuda. I know a lot of people had in their minds, including myself, the idea that he would at the very least be a top 9 player, as in finding himself on the third line for game 1 of the regular season, if not just be immediately in the top 6. And yet, this first game here was not a very good showing for Will Smith. His first period was okay. We got to see some of that elite vision on display, but those passes were very few and far between, and more often than not, I would say about 80% of the shifts that he had, he really wasn't all that noticeable of a player. If you had told me that this was just some like third round pick who the Sharks just picked up last year, I would say, oh, you know, he had like a pretty good game, but nothing special. So the fact that he is the 4th overall pick from the last year's draft, the 2023 draft, and was expected to really make a big splash here, definitely a little disappointing to see. Now, it should be noted in Smith's favor is that unlike Celebrini, who did get to play with Tyler Toffoli, who looked really good in the previous game, there were some struggles with Smith's line mates for sure. This was not a cohesive line at all. There was literally zero chemistry between these three players. You still have to take some more personal responsibility, and Smith on his own individually really didn't look all that great. And another thing that is maybe even slightly worrying than that, it was said that Will Smith had put on some extra weight here, gained some extra strength over this offseason to really be able to hang out at the NHL level. And yet, going against players who even I wouldn't recognize by name here on the Anaheim Ducks, players who likely will find themselves majority in the AHL for this upcoming season, even they were able to muscle Will Smith off these pucks. So once he gets to that NHL level against the real top-tier defensemen in the league, it's not going to get any easier. So definitely a bit of a growing pains type of game for Will Smith. He'll likely get at least a couple of more looks in the preseason, and hopefully he can only go up from here. When it comes to his two line mates, as I said, struggled immensely. We start off with Barclay Goodrow. This to me was just an incredibly odd decision by Ryan Warsofsky to have Goodrow on this second line. One would think you would want to put Will Smith into a position to succeed, and so like with Celebrini a couple of days ago, I thought Smith would end up on a line with Tyler Toffoli and not with Barclay Goodrow, who as a player is barely even a fourth liner in the NHL. There is no secret that that is the case. There's a reason why the New York Rangers were willing to put him on waivers, and there's a reason why the entire league, everyone around this league, were sort of drawing a blank when the Sharks actually decided to pick up Barclay Goodrow off of waivers from the Rangers. It didn't really make a lot of sense, as did this lineup decision here tonight. Even in the first period where the San Jose Sharks were actually looking very good and were rolling their lines decently well, Goodrow was probably one of the worst players for the San Jose Sharks. He just simply was not doing a lot here. He was not a positive contributor, especially offensively on the ice for the San Jose Sharks, and it's somewhat disappointing to see because, as we know, Warsofsky is a big fan of Barclay Goodrow. He's likely to be a staple in the lineup for this upcoming season. I would not be surprised, barring injury, if he actually gets all 82 games this next year. And so to see him already in preseason not looking particularly good, and I'd be surprised if he actually had even much higher of a ceiling than this, is sort of worrying, but also not all that surprising. When it comes to the other winger on this line, we have Fabian Zetterlund. Now, kind of like with William Eklund, he is a sort of an established player who I was still expecting to have a bit of a bang in this preseason because he's still quite young, still trying to prove himself and find a home for himself in the NHL, even if he was getting those big first-line minutes last season, especially under now a new coach, although Warsofsky was technically with the team last year. So I was expecting a bit of a better game from Zetterlund. And I will say, positionally, I thought Zetterlund actually found himself in the right place at the right time a lot of times here. So he's still reading the game at a pretty high level. The issue that Zetterlund had mostly here tonight was actually his puck management. It felt as though a lot of the times his passes just weren't connecting, or the puck was bouncing over his stick, or he would end up fanning on these shots. And it was just a really rough game to actually watch from Zetterlund's perspective. The good news is because these are all very, very fixable mistakes, I don't think this is necessarily going to be something that really impacts him going into this next season. But as with Eklund in the previous game, it was a slight disappointing start to this season. We're hoping it's just shaking off the cobwebs. Then we get to the third line. This is where we have Bistet as well as Gushin and Luke Kunin. And I'll start off with Luke Kunin because it kind of goes back to Barclay Goodrow as well this point. These are two players that I am not really excited to see on the San Jose Sharks roster this season. Both players who I really don't think necessarily belong in the NHL or are very all that good, and yet will likely have a locked down roster spot this season. The good news at the very least is that while Goodrow struggled this game, I actually thought Kunin started it off rather well. His first couple of shifts on this third line actually got me thinking that maybe we would get a bit of a new Luke Kunin this season. And while he did fade into the background and not really look all that great as this game wore on, that start is at least promising enough for me to not be completely down on Luke Kunin right out the gate here. So it wasn't some outstanding game that is clearly changing my thoughts about this player, but there is some hope that maybe he might not have as bad of a season as he did last year. Then we get to Filip Bystedt. Bystedt played in the Rookie Faceoff tournament last week, and he really wasn't all that impressive as a former first-rounder for the San Jose Sharks, who is now a couple of years removed from his draft year, and you're hoping really to be able to take those big steps. It was definitely disappointing to see that that didn't happen last week. But here tonight, he definitely turned things around. Filip Bystedt actually had a really good game, was one of the Sharks' better forwards, in particular in that first period, of course, where I thought he really drove his line exceptionally well. On the power play, I thought he was also probably the best player on the Sharks' second power play unit in that first period, so he had a lot of success in those areas, and that does spark some hope that things are going to go well for him this season. Obviously, still a far cry from being at the NHL level, but since he is likely hoping to be a top center, at least in the top 6 for the San Jose Barracuda this year, this was the good first game to have here in preseason to set himself up well for that role. And then we have Danil Gushchin. Gushchin, like with Thomas Bordeleau, who unfortunately is a week-to-week injury, which is going to make his dreams of being on the NHL roster this season quite difficult to achieve. Like with Bordeleau, him and Gushchin are kind of in this weird limbo category where they were prospects that were drafted by the previous regime here in San Jose, by Doug Wilson, and kind of haven't really been given the time of day by this new regime, by Mike Grier, as they have been leapfrogged in the depth charts by a lot of the other players that the Sharks have kind of drafted and traded for. So Gushchin, it's not going to be an easy time to make it to the NHL roster. He needed to prove himself in preseason, and this first game, I thought he did a very wonderful job at that. He was all over the ice in that first period in a good way. He showed off very incredible speed. His goal in this game, which made it 1-0 San Jose, was very, very reminiscent of some of the goals that he has scored in the NHL in the past. I believe it was almost identical to the goal he scored near the end of last season, I believe against the Edmonton Oilers, so clearly something that he goes with, and he has a very, very good shot. His power play performance was also quite solid on that second power play unit, which was far and away better than the Sharks' first power play unit, and while he wasn't nearly as good in that second and third period, like with the rest of the team, like something I've said for pretty much every other player here, I still thought it was generally a positive outing for Gushchin and sets himself up decently well to continue his challenge of being able to make it to the Sharks' main roster for this upcoming season. And considering that Will Smith struggled out the gate here for this game 1 of the preseason, and perhaps he might be heading to the San Jose Barracuda, even if it is still technically a bit too early to say that, there is the potential room in the top 6, or at the very least the top 9, for Gushchin to make a play for it, and this is definitely a good first step. Then we get to the Sharks' fourth line. The fourth line struggled in the previous game against the Vegas Golden Knights. It is a completely new look here tonight with Sabourin, White, and Justin Bailey, and yet they still struggled. Justin Bailey was probably one of the more disappointing players. It's kind of weird to say. He was quite good, honestly, in the role that he was played in last year for the San Jose Sharks. And while there were a lot of different players brought in to play above him in the lineup, and it was unlikely he'd manage to land an NHL spot, I thought he'd still look quite solid. But here tonight, outside of showcasing his speed, which we already knew he had, the skill just wasn't really there, and it was a rough game for sure for Bailey. The same will go for Colin White, who also showed off decent speed, but not much else. And then Scott Sabourin, we saw him get into a fight within the first couple of minutes, but that was really the most notable part of his game, outside of like one decent shift in the first period where I thought he had a couple of good plays. He then fell off a cliff and wasn't particularly noticeable. So this fourth line, not good here tonight either. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. We have the top pairing of Jake Wallman and Jan Rutta, perhaps a preview of a pairing that we might see going into next season. depending on how things actually end up working out. And I'll start off with Jan Rutta, who I actually thought was perhaps the Sharks' best defenseman on the night. I really appreciated Jan Rutta's performance, which was a bit of a surprise considering he is a veteran player on the back end here in preseason, his first game of the year. You're expecting him to be not particularly fast, to not be particularly engaged, kind of like what we saw with Cody Ceci and Mario Ferraro in the previous game. And yet, I thought Rutta was actually playing as though this was a real regular season game. He was making some aggressive pinches in the offensive zone, which was quite nice to see most of the time, though a couple of times it did backfire a bit, but most of the time he found some success with that. Actually showed off a bit more of an offensive flair, at least at even strength, than Jake Wallman had in this game, which was definitely a bit of a surprise. And so I was rather impressed with what Rutta was able to show off. When it comes to Jake Wallman, we know that he's kind of being groomed to try and be the Sharks' #1 offensive defenseman going into this next season, but there were definitely some speed bumps here on the way to that. In the first power play unit that the Sharks had going here tonight, Jake Wallman struggled as the power play quarterback. In fact, I take a look at Cagnoni in that similar position in that first preseason game, and he was miles better than whatever we saw from Jake Wallman. To be fair, Cagnoni got to work with what is likely to be the Sharks' first power play unit in terms of forwards next season: Granlund, Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli. Meanwhile, this first power play unit tonight with Wallman as the quarterback was a lot more dysfunctional. There just wasn't a lot of chemistry and synergy between Zetterlund and Smith and Toffoli and Wenberg. So you do have to at least say that, but still, I wasn't super impressed offensively with what Wallman was able to do. Defensively, I thought he was still quite decent. It wasn't, the ultimate challenge for him, considering the Ducks didn't ice the most competitive lineup here tonight, but at least it wasn't bad, which is a good thing. Then we get to the second pairing. Here we have Thompson. So he is the other player besides Toffoli to actually be in the lineup for the second straight night. I don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean, if they wanted to see more from Thompson or if he just ends up drawing the short straw. Whatever the case may be, I thought Thompson, like in the previous game, had another solid night. He actually scored the third goal of this game for the San Jose Sharks. I believe that was on the power play, if I'm not mistaken, because he was on that second power play unit. And so generally, I was still, again, impressed with what Thompson was able to do. And then we have his defensive partner here tonight, Schultz. He was okay enough. I guess you could say not a particularly notable player here. Is technically not even in the San Jose Sharks organization, if I am not mistaken. And so it kind of a not very notable game for him. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, this is where a lot of the San Jose Sharks struggles really stemmed from. This pairing of Keeney and Hache was just awful here tonight. Hache showed some promise in the rookie face-off tournament, got a couple of games even up there with Luca Cagnoni on the top pairing, was pretty decent, but this was very, very far from a good performance. They struggled immensely in their own zone. Defensively, it was a disaster. Physically, I guess they were able to use their bodies decently well, but there's a reason that said that players who accumulate so many hits, it's because you don't have the puck and are forced to actually get those hits. That was very much the case with both of these players. Just an unmitigated disaster in the defensive zone for sure for the two of them. And then on the goaltending side, we had Vitek Vanacek get the first half of this game. It was another similar situation as the previous one where they split down the middle with Blackwood and Romanov. Tonight it was Vanacek and Carrier. Vanacek I thought was solid enough in the first period, in the first half. He didn't actually have to do much in that first period, so he really wasn't challenged all that much. And the one goal that the Ducks would score in the early second really can't be put much blame on Vanacek, who likely is not used to the extremely bouncy boards at the SAP Center that made this an easy tap-in goal for the Ducks player. Once Carrier stepped in for the second half, that's where the struggles really started to come up here, as a couple of these goals that he let in, 2 of the 3, I would say, were quite bad, and ones he absolutely should have been able to have. So Carrier obviously came in here already quite far down the Sharks' depth charts. He's behind Blackwood, he's behind Vanacek, he's behind Askarov, he's behind Romanov. So he's not exactly the most big name Sharks goaltender in their system, and this game did not do anything to actually move him up, perhaps even moved him slightly down. Not the best outing, but that will do it for this review. The San Jose Sharks will be back in action in a couple of days on Thursday for their third preseason game. Still likely to be a lineup very much in flux. I suspect a lot of these players will not be in the lineup for that game before we finally get to lock things down in the latter half of the preseason. Class dismissed.